The views and opinions expressed during Eye on the Triangle do not represent WKNC or NC State student media. Your dial is currently tuned to Eye on the Triangle on WKNC 88.1 FM HD1. Thanks for listening. Good morning, everyone. Hope you're enjoying your day. My name is Emilia Rivadeneira, host of Eye on the Triangle, and with further ado, let's get into some news. Hello and welcome to WKNC's Eye on the Triangle, your source of local news where we dive deep into the pressing issues affecting our communities. I'm your host, Emilia Rivadeneira, and today I'm here with Robert Scheller, Associate Dean for Research in the College of Natural Resources at North Carolina State University. Thank you so much for being here today, Robert. How are you doing?
You're welcome. I'm doing well. Thanks.
Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about an issue that will seemingly happening far away from our campus and from the Triangle area. It impacts us all regardless, and that is the recent wildfires happening in California and what they mean for the environment, climate change, and even life here on the East Coast. So to get us started, I wanted to ask you, so California wildfires have become more frequent over the years. Could you explain some of the key factors driving this trend?
Yeah, fires across the West Coast have been increasing, particularly over the last 20 years or so. And it's primarily driven by increased aridity. So we're seeing warmer temperatures, oftentimes less precipitation. And it's a combination, of course, that uh, is very conducive to wildfires, right? So wildfires are responding to the moisture of the fuels, the leaves and branches that propel a fire. They also increase the odds of ignition. And particularly when we see these cases with really high wind speeds, it creates a perfect conditions for wildfire.
Right. And also, I was reading actually some of the recent news in this specifically like fire that happened in California. Um, and it was fueled by powerful winds and dry conditions. And also it was mentioned that it started in a backyard, if I'm correct. Like it just started there and then it kind of like grew into what it was. So what would you say are the kind of immediate and long-term effects of these wildfires on California's ecosystems specifically?
Well, yeah, it's a big question. Um, of course, the immediate effects are loss of human lives, thousands of homes destroyed, just a surge in air pollution. So incredibly bad for environmental health. It's unlike when a fire burns through a forest where it's primarily burning natural materials, wood and leaves and so on. When homes are burning, you think about all the plastic that's in a home and the PVC pipes and so on. The pollution coming out of a home is just incredible. Just a toxic mix of benzenes and other volatile organic compounds. So the immediate effects are going to be, it's ongoing right now. People are suffering, people are displaced, their health is at risk, and so on. The longer term effects, immediately around Los Angeles, uh, and you asked about the ecosystem. Um, these are fire adapted ecosystems, and the ecosystems around Los Angeles will be fine. So those areas are dominated by chaparral and some forests, and they're definitely fire adapted. I'm not worried about the ecosystems in and around Los Angeles. They'll be okay. Um, Longer term for the human communities, we're talking about this being a $150 billion disaster, and that number just keeps going up. Many of these folks didn't have home insurance. What does that mean when if you don't have home insurance, or if your insurer can't cover these kind of losses? Um, more broadly around California, we're seeing huge increases in fire, um, and for a variety of reasons, including climate change. These fires are more severe than we've witnessed in the past, and oftentimes we're seeing the loss of forests. So we're losing some of the iconic forests in and around California. My research particularly touches on the Sierra Nevada, which runs up and down, uh, the spine of California. And, there's just a potential to lose some of those iconic forests. They'll convert more into shrublands over time. Um, and, shrublands have their own value, but those forests in the Sierra Nevada are really special places that people are invested in, and so and it's a loss of wildlife habitat, just a lot of consequences to losing so many fires, causing so much forest loss in a pretty fairly quick amount of time.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you bring up the forest loss specifically because I wanted to touch on how specifically just like forest loss impacts climate change, like the bigger picture of climate
Hmm.
change. Like um with those like wildfires that are happening right now, we're losing trees, we're losing wildlife, and how does that kind of like paint the bigger picture on climate change and like it affects us like on the long term?
Yeah, great question. So forests are a huge carbon sink, meaning that forests are just pulling a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere and sequestering that carbon in a pretty stable form over time. And so forests have played a big role in absorbing a lot of the carbon humans have been emitting over the last 150 years, 200 years. But what we're seeing with these big wildfires, not just in the United States, we're talking Canada, around the world, we're seeing incredible increase in wildfire. And so what's happening is those forests are no longer the sinks that they used to be, that oftentimes are emitting a lot of carbon now to the atmosphere. Uh, there's two effects, of course. It's emitting a lot of carbon, so that can amplify climate change. And they're just not able to absorb as much carbon as they used to. When you start losing forests, you're losing that carbon sequestration potential. So that hampers our ability to deal with climate change over time. So globally, we're starting to see more and more forests becoming carbon sources rather than sinks. Now, it's often driven by wildfire, but drought plays a big role as well. Say in the Amazon basin, a lot of the Amazon forests, they're burning, but they're also just being lost due to drought, another climate change induced um, threat.
Yeah, and I wanted to also ask, how does this kind of like impact global warming specifically? Because I know that you mentioned, um, like how the forests are more like are not as absorbing as much like carbon.
Yeah,
Um, and also like wildfires in the opposite release just like significant amounts of this carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so could you explain how this impacts like efforts to curb global warming nowadays?
yeah. Well, so I mean, planet Earth is blessed with forests and other ecosystems that absorb carbon, a lot of carbon over time. So it's an incredible um, sink of carbon where it's pulling the carbon out of the atmosphere. And it's that carbon in the atmosphere that's really driving global warming. And so if we lose that capacity to pull carbon out of the atmosphere, it just amplifies global warming. I don't know, was that a good enough, quick, succinct
No, yeah,
explanation?
that did touch on what I was asking and kind of like changing to the subject on just like the East Coast. I know that, like the West Coast is like pretty far and like wildfires do not tend to happen here on the East Coast, but we have seen instances in the past where smoke from West Coast fires affects just air quality across the country. And so, what would be kind of like the potential health implications for East Coast residents?
Well, of course, smoke from Canada, more of the smoke that we experience here on the East Coast is coming from the north of us rather than all the way out to the West Coast. But the smoke hazard is real. And, in the last couple of years, we've seen the East Coast blanketed with smoke, but we shouldn't rule out increase in fire in the across the East Coast. So I also do a lot of research in the Appalachian Mountains. And again, as the climate warms, we should expect more and more fire over time. And so some of the research we've conducted here indicates that the amount of fire in the Appalachians could be 5 times as much fire. And we've also seen, in the relatively recent past, in 2017, there was a fire in the Appalachians that burned into Gatlinburg, Tennessee, and 30 people died. So the East Coast is not immune to the effects of wildfires, and we expect that to increase over time. And layering on top of that, we're never going to have as much wildfire as the West Coast. It just is not, we have just a lot more humidity and rain over the summer. We don't have a long, prolonged dry summer like they do on the West Coast.
Right.
But what's different is the population is much higher here in the East. So we have a lot more people living in and around our forests here in the East Coast. So most of the land in the East Coast is privately owned and heavily developed. That's really different from the West Coast, where most of the land is federally owned and not developed. And so when we do have fires in the East Coast, it puts more people at risk. And we also see some of the same hazards here in the East Coast that we have seen in the West Coast. This fire in Los Angeles, there's certain neighborhoods where they have very poor evacuation routes. And so really rugged terrain means that there's just not a lot of roads going in and out of these neighborhoods. We have the same situation in the Appalachians, where again, really rugged terrain that causes a couple different problems. One is that rugged terrain can funnel wind and accelerate wind speeds. And higher elevations, you often have higher wind speeds. So we have that same risk. It's not as high as California, where they have the Santa Ana winds, which are just incredible. But there is a risk for high wind speeds here in the Appalachians, and that can really accelerate fires. And just the risk of topography, where you have these just narrow roads in and out of these areas, particularly areas. I don't know if you spend a lot of time in the Appalachians, but it's kind of Airbnb central, where you have all these folks who have
Yeah.
little familiarity with the landscape. They certainly don't have familiarity with fire, and they don't understand how quickly fires can move across the landscape. So this is one of the big risks in the East Coast, is that we have more people out on the landscape, and these people are very unfamiliar with fire. So people in the West Coast, a lot of people have a go bag. So they have a bag with all their most precious things, documentation, like the deed to their house and other important uh, personal items in a bag that they ready to evacuate at a moment's notice. Most of them often know their evacuation route. Not always. Like we saw in Los Angeles, people did not know their evacuation routes. But they're just a lot more, fire prepared on the West Coast. Here on the East Coast, we are very unprepared for fires. People don't have experience with them. We don't have a lot of the infrastructure and planning in place should a big fire break out here on the East Coast.
Yeah. And that's really interesting that you mentioned the Appalachian Mountains, and like I didn't even thought about that and thought about like, the potential of wildfires happening here in the East Coast in the Appalachian. I feel like a lot of people just assume that that's never going to happen here, and they're just like,
Oh,
"Oh, that's happening in the West Coast," and
yeah.
that's
It
it.
has happened here. Yes, there is risk in the East Coast for wildfires, as we saw in 2016 with a big fire that in went from North Carolina into Tennessee and caused the death of 30 people.
Right.
And it's not just the Appalachians. I should point out the Appalachians is the area I study in the East Coast, but I think it's a risk up and down, the broader Appalachian range, anywhere where you have this rugged topography, where there's fewer roads and more continuous forests, that's where the risk is. Oak forests are also part of the risk, and pine forests accentuate the risk. But that's not all of the East Coast. Parts of the East Coast, say Eastern North Carolina, are much less at risk. Not that a fire couldn't start there under the right conditions, but that's an area with a lot of roads and it's relatively flat. So it'd be much easier for firefighters to get in there and control a fire in
Right.
Eastern North Carolina. But it's where you have that rugged terrain and, very continuous forests. There's not agriculture, of course, on top of the Appalachians, that you have just continuous fuels that you can get big fires
Yeah.
happening in the east.
Yeah. And what are the difference between like, of the West Coast and the East Coast? Like, for example, in like causes of these fires and like the Appalachian Mountains, like what's some sort of like
Excuse
distinction?
me, I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
Um, what was the word you used? The difference?
Yeah, kind of like the difference in causes of these wildfires
Oh,
in the
the
West Coast.
cost.
Yeah, the cost. No, no, not the cost, but the cost of the wildfire. Is it the same causes that start the
Oh, the
wildfires?
same. How do they start?
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, um, yeah. The causes of fire are fairly similar between the east and west coast, which is humans. Humans cause most fires. So most ignitions are human caused. There's, some slight differences. You do get more lightning ignited fires in the West Coast than you do in the East Coast. They get dry lightning in the West Coast, whereas in the East Coast, it's generally like a heavy rainstorm when we're having lightning. But in both places, it's largely human ignitions. Um, and most of those are accidental ignitions, of course, and it could be someone burning a brush pile, careless camper. Arson is sometimes the cause of, probably more arson than we would care for, of course. Any arson is bad arson,
Yeah.
but there's more than people expect as far as arson as a cause. But it is primarily humans causing fires.
And how could people from the East Coast kind of prepare? I know that you mentioned, for example, in the West Coast, these wildfires every year are something that like residents are kind of not expecting, but like, like they know that it happens. And they
Yeah.
have like you mentioned like their bag, like with their documents and stuff. But like here, residents on the East Coast, like they're not thinking about that type of stuff. Like usually it never happens. So like what would be kind of like a recommendation for them to kind of like follow?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. For the individual, I don't know that I have any recommendations for just an individual. A lot of this preparation has to happen more at an institutional level. In other words, making sure that we have firefighting equipment available where places are at risk, making sure that we're monitoring the weather and the fuels on the ground to make sure, if we enter a condition that we're, a heightened condition, a condition where the risk is high, that we're putting, resources in place, firefighting equipment in place, and so on. Um, and there's things that the governor can do, as far as instituting burn bans, making it illegal to have any fires whatsoever under these extremely dry weather conditions. Um, an individual homeowner can do some preparation if you have a house that's neighboring a forest or embedded within the forest, is making sure that there's some distance between the house and any vegetation. So, and it doesn't have to be totally void of vegetation, but you want to reduce any low shrubs that could particularly carry fire immediately into a house. And there's also things such as home construction, what kind of siding does your house have, and other factors that can be done more at an individual level, but there often needs to be incentives and education for people to even know to, improve their practices in and around their house. Um, and it comes down to we would have to think about evacuation routes and just making sure people are aware and, maybe even thinking about for these home rentals, Airbnb and VRBO are super popular in the Appalachians,
Yeah,
making sure that information is available to people in case a fire did break out. Like, well,
right.
which way do you go? How do you get out of there?
Yeah. And a quick question. You mentioned kind of what are the months in the East Coast that are most like dry, like, what could be considered dry months in which we should be kind of like
Yeah.
aware of, like all of these suggestions.
Yeah. The risk is highest in the spring and the fall, generally speaking.
Okay.
So in the winter, there's often, rain or snow, which doesn't evaporate very quickly. Just there's a lot less sunshine, a lot less solar radiation drying out the fuels in the winter. So that's a relatively low risk time. And then in the summer, we have the increase in humidity as
Yeah.
well as just the green up of the forest. So now the leaves come out, and the leaves create kind of a biological barrier to fire. They're not as conducive to burning. So when you have a really green forest, high humidity in the summer, we all know what that is here in North Carolina. The risk is also pretty
Yeah.
low at that time. And so it's a spring and fall. In the fall, you have the freshly fallen leaves from oak trees and pine trees, particularly create hazardous conditions. Um, and the same true in the spring after the winter's over and that fuel dries out again, is that hazard again.
Right. Um, and this is kind of like a similar question of my previous one about suggestions. But since you mentioned that it it's mostly like more on the side of like institutional kind of like reforms, I wanted to ask if there are any lessons from the West Coast response to wildfires that could inform kind of climate resilience strategies here on the East Coast, specifically on the institutional level.
Yeah. Well, that's a tough question to answer right now because you look at Los Angeles today and you would say that they were unprepared.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what lessons do we learn from Los Angeles? Um, but some of this does have to do with a little bit their lack of preparation. And it's really the timing isn't good to ask that question or answer the question because people are really suffering right now. And now is not a great time to be assigning blame on fire departments or individual homeowners. Now's the time to really think about how do we support people? How do we, help the major metropolitan area dealing with a crisis right now?
Yeah.
Um, that's why it's a tough question to answer. But after the fires are out, we can start asking these questions about were the homeowners adequately prepared? Were they, practicing good practices of keeping the vegetation away from their homes? Did people know their evacuation routes? Were they prepared for that? Did everyone have their go bags? Did they know where, the elderly parents or grandparents, were they safe? Were all these good practices in place to keep people out of harm? And we're going to have to wait till these fires are over before we start answering those questions.
No, yeah, for sure. Um, and also for NC State students who, are passionate about addressing climate change and also just, in general, what would you say are some actions that we can take as students, to kind of make a difference both locally here on the East Coast and globally, regarding just like climate change?
Yeah. Well, in regards to climate change, you know, there's there's a number of actors. There's, the government sets policy around climate change. Corporations have an important role to play in whether they're promoting wise use of fossil fuels versus extravagant uses of fossil fuels. Are they being honest with the public about, risks of climate change? So corporations play a role, but individuals also play a role. We each, you know, can, through our individual actions, reduce climate change. And, I get it, not any one individual probably isn't going to be important, but if we collectively act, change our behaviors, that's going to be huge. And people's behavior changes corporate behavior. We have to realize, if we stop buying things with a large carbon footprint, then corporations will start selling things that have a smaller carbon footprint.
Yeah.
Um, you know, Leading into, what should individuals be doing? It's well known, and I don't have the resources right at my fingertips, but you can look up what are the primary carbon sources from any individual's behavior. One of it is, what kind of proteins do you eat? Beef is widely known to be absolutely the worst source of proteins in regard to carbon emissions. Beef and lamb in particular. That doesn't mean you have to give up meat. There's a lot of meats that have, much, much lower carbon footprints than beef. Reducing air travel, another huge activity people can do. Particularly international air travel is a huge emitter of carbon. People should think about what is their commute time, how far are they commuting, and how frequently are they commuting. Um, those are some of the few off the top of my head really big, individual behaviors that lead to higher carbon emissions
Right.
uh,
Mm.
that lead to more climate change.
Yeah. Um, and another thing that I wanted to ask, I know that it's very easy to feel overwhelmed with climate news and by climate news. So, to you specifically, kind of what gives you hope when it comes to our ability to adapt and to address all of these challenges, specifically with wildfires and just in general climate change?
Yeah, without a doubt, it can be, you know, tough, particularly when you're witnessing a catastrophe like where you are right now, or earlier this year with Western North Carolina and the
Yeah.
hurricane, to be optimistic and hopeful. Um, but, climate change is going to be a multi-generational fight. And so we need to look at, what are the longer trends that are, happening over the last 30 years, and that will happen over the next 50 years. So we have to think longer term horizons. And you start looking at longer term horizons, and that's where I start to see the hope, which is that we have really developed all the technology we need to bring our carbon emissions down. I don't know that we'll ever hit net zero, to be honest, but we can bring it down to a level that climate change will not be the dominant story in our lives. We have all this technology, and it's just about deploying the technology. And the great news is we have been deploying this technology just incredibly rapidly. Now, it's going to take, 10, 15, 20 years before we really get it scaled up to where it needs to be. But we are rapidly moving forward. And I'm thinking about, solar panels, of course, batteries that can store renewable power, a grid that can handle renewable power. Those are the big things that really give me hope. We have these technologies, we're deploying them so rapidly right now. They're just taking off like crazy. And
Yeah.
so that's really hopeful. Um, we also need to change some of our behaviors again, as far as, meat consumption and other behaviors. And some of those might take longer than these, deploying solar panels.
Right.
But we're making progress. And so, you got to look beyond the bad news of the day and start looking at, our collective efforts. We are, turning the corner on this. It's still going to be another, again, I think 40, 50 years before we're totally out of the woods, and we'd see some devastating things in the meantime. But yeah, that's in your lifetime anyways. Maybe not in mine, but in yours.
Yeah, I hopefully yes. And I mean that's another thing that it's like the multi-generational um thing that you mentioned. I think like I agree with that. And it's just like it has to be changed through like all of these generations like that are coming and like it's just all about change. So,
Yeah.
yeah. Um but yeah, is there anything else would you like to add before we wrap up?
Um, I guess I would add that we can all play a role, everyone. There's a lot you can do. One of the biggest things you can do is vote. And, you know, just always look for the opportunities to contribute when you can and how you can and where you can. And we absolutely, I think one of the biggest battles is to fight against despair. We don't want people giving up. We are making progress, but it is going to be a long fight. And, there's going to be setbacks along the way. But we just need everyone, moving in the same direction and doing what we can, where we can. And that's what, fills me with hope.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Um, on that note, thank you all for tuning in to WKNC Eye in the Triangle. And thank you, Robert, for accompanying us today. It was great to have you on the program.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, thanks.
Take care.
Um, take care. Bye.
Bye.
This has been your host, Emilia Rivadeneira. Thanks for listening to Eye on the Triangle. For back episodes of the show, go to wknc.org/podcasts. Music in today's episode is Krakatoa by Noah Stark, licensed under Creative Commons.